Welcome, everybody, to the seventh evening lecture in the Rare Book School Summer Lecture Series, and welcome especially to our audience who are on Zoom. Our speaker tonight, James H. Marrow, is Professor Emeritus of Art History at Princeton University and Honorary Keeper of Illuminated Manuscripts at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England. The author of more than a dozen scholarly books, and I should say a lot more than a dozen scholarly books. He was professor of art history at Berkeley and has been a visiting fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Professor Marrow has published widely on Northern European art of the late Middle Ages, with special attention to questions of meaning in works of religious art, and on manuscript illumination in the Low Countries, in Germany, and in France. Among his many distinctions, Professor Marrow has been elected as a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America and as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He also holds an honorary doctorate from the Université Charles de Gaulle in Lille. He is a past president of the United States National Committee for the History of Art. I could go on, but you should hear him, not me. We are deeply, deeply honored to have Professor Marrow addressing us today. Please join me in warmly welcoming him.
Thank you very much. As Emily said, her mother would have been appreciative of the introduction you gave her. My mother would have been appreciative, but she'd have tried to rebut a few things. This is a perfect audience to lecture to, because I'm going to lecture about a manuscript that's a problem, full of problems, not all of which are solvable and can only be dealt with hypotheses. And I can't think of a better audience to present this to. So my subject today is a very little known Flemish illuminated manuscript of circa 1470 that contains a highly idiosyncratic cycle of illumination. I chose this topic because the manuscript in question raises a host of questions, not all of them answerable, concerning book production in Flanders during the late 15th century, and some of the challenges of coming to terms with text and picture cycles that are anomalous, literally outside the norm. The manuscript I'll discuss today has been in private collections throughout its known history, hence largely inaccessible for study. So far as I know, only one opening of facing leaves from the manuscript has ever been reproduced in the catalog of a sale at Sotheby's in 1956. And instead of that very bad black and white plate, I'm going to show you a color of that opening that was reproduced there. So it's a manuscript of some ambition and quality. And no full analytical description of the volume has been published. Indeed, even the contents have not been correctly described. In the catalog of the sale of 1956, the manuscript is described vaguely and inadequately as a book of devotion. The core text of the manuscript is a full psalter, but of a rare type that has short collects or prayers after each of the 150 psalms, followed by the customary office canticles that normally accompany liturgical psalters. And in psalter collects, after every psalm, back to the first psalm, there is a prayer, and that would be here, and then always per Christum Dominum Nostrum, Amen. And then here's the next psalm, Psalm 2, and at the end of Psalm 2, you have the prayer, per Christum, and this is the beginning of Psalm 3. Every psalm, you just put a short prayer like that. So-called Roman series of psalter collects, but in any case, and I want you to notice as well, so I'll come back to this, that it's missing rubrics. That would be for the psalm and one for the collect as well. The Psalter and Canticles, which occupy 288 folios, are followed by equally rare texts, at least in the form in which they appear in this book, of extremely highly abbreviated versions of the Hours of the Virgin and the Office of the Dead. The Hours of the Virgin, seen there, occupies a mere 15 folios, and the Office of the Dead 13 folios, which are radically shorter than any version of those texts I've ever encountered. Basically, what they did is they got rid of all the invocations that begin hours. Go ahead, love you. Laudem Tullio Deus, and every psalm for basically that. They don't write out any of them. They just say Venite exultemus, etc. So the psalms are just done with deluxe iconium, etc. Most psalms are written out, no invocations. So they shrunk it grammatically. In their unusual form and location, these two texts appear to have been little more than afterthoughts to the Psalter and Canticles, which are the real core of the manuscript. The only other text in the manuscript is a calendar on the first 12 leaves of the volume. This contains entries of saints characteristic of Flanders, and particularly Bruges. And Basilius on June 14, and Donatiano on November 14. Basilius. On the basis of the combination of saints cited in the calendar and the style of the volume's decoration and illustration, including even those pen flourishes, the manuscript was likely made in and for use in Bruges. The man and woman for whom the manuscript was presumably made are depicted in the margins of full-page miniatures of David in Penitence. Their man is here and the woman is there. Of the crucifixion, they're both together there. And only one of them, the man, in the Annunciation. There are, unfortunately, no other indications in the volume to enable this couple to be identified. Because the manuscript belonged in the late 19th century to John Ruskin, it has his bookplate, it's nowadays referred to as the Ruskin Psalter Hours. Not a good title because there are other manuscripts earlier known as the Ruskin Psalter Hours. The cycles of illustration in the Ruskin Psalter Hours are incongruous and disjunctive in their subject matter and their placement in the volume. The most coherent series of images is the cycle of 9 historiated initials of the core text of the manuscript, which introduces the 8 daily divisions of the Psalms and the first of the office canticles. So basically, throughout the Psalm, there are historiated initials in 𝗧𝗹𝗸 or Bray, 9 of them. Painted by one unknown illuminator, whose work differs in style from that of the 11 full-page miniatures in the volume, the cycle consists of depictions of events from the Old Testament that normally function as prefigurations of events from the Passion. This intended association can be confirmed because 6 of the 9 historiated initials are derivative copies of illustrations from the block book edition of the Biblia Pauperum, Pauper's Bible. Did I skip one? No, okay. That's the whole series of 9. And that's what a block book edition of the Biblia Pauperum looks like. And so, diagrammatic books, the New Testament scene is in the middle, and it's flanked by 2 Old Testament illustrations. So for the crucifixion, the sacrifice of Isaac, and Moses with the great serpent. Isaac carrying the wood of the sacrifice. So let's look at those things that are the same. The historiated initial of Joab slays Abner derives and descends from the woodcut of the same subject at the left of the illustration of the arrest of Christ in the block book edition of the Biblia Pauperum. Same kind of path, and with a knife stabbing him in the back and so forth. The historiated initial of Isaac carrying the wood with which he was to be sacrificed is a close copy of the illustration of the same event to the left of the illustration of the carrying of the cross in the block book of the Biblia Pauperum. The historian initial of 𝗧𝗹𝗸 seeks to slay Elias, sending a messenger to him. She's enthroned, and that's the messenger she's charging. Closely echoes and derives from the woodcut of the same subject at the left of the illustration of Christ condemned, or the hand-washing of Pilate in the Biblia Pauperum. The historian initial of Moses and the brazen serpent echoes the woodcut of the same subject at the right, this time, of the crucifixion in the block book edition of the Biblia Pauperum. The historian initial, this is the fifth, of Samson carrying off the gates of Gaza derives from the woodcut of the same subject at the left of the illustration of the resurrection in the block book of the Biblia Pauperum. And finally, the historian initial of David beheading Goliath echoes many of the main features and derives from the woodcut of the same subject at the left of the illustration of the harrowing of hell in the block book edition of the Biblia Pauperum. I don't know the pictorial sources of the remaining three historiated initials of scenes from the Old Testament in this cycle, but they are also depictions of incidents that commonly function as prefigurations of events from Christ's Passion. In sequence, those events, the events traditionally prefigured by the full cycle of 9 historiated initials from the Old Testament in the Ruskin Psalter Hours would constitute a relatively coherent cycle of the Passion, as I can illustrate in this table. That's the prefiguration of the historiated initials. Those are the subjects that go with them: arrest, flagellation, carrying the cross, Christ condemned, crucifixion, piercing of Christ's side, entombment, resurrection, harrowing of hell. It's a coherent cycle. As one might expect from its series of historiated initials, the Ruskin Psalter Hours contains a cycle of full-page miniatures of the Passion. But this cycle of illustration consists of only 7 of the 9 miniatures of which it is composed. It is out of alignment with the historiated initials with which it is paired, and the other 2 full-page miniatures in this portion of the volume are not of Passion images of all. To indicate the mismatched subjects of the full-page miniatures and the historiated initials that each faces, I list the historiated initial at each opening with an accompanying full-page miniature, the event from the Passion that in typological cycles would normally accompany the event from the Old Testament, but then I list the full-page miniatures that actually face each of the historiated initials. To distinguish the 2 full-page miniatures that do not depict events from the Passion, the first and the last, I indicate their subjects in italics. As is evident from this table, none of the full-page miniatures of the Passion in the volume lines up with the subjects that would accord with the depictions they face of events from the Old Testament. It carries the wood, Peter carries the cross. Here it's Christ before Pilate. Joseph cast in the well should be the entombment. It's the descent from the cross. The whole series is off. In addition, 2 of the full-page miniatures, the ones indicated by italics in my table, are not Passion subjects at all. The first full-page miniature facing Psalm 1, that's on the left, depicts David in penitence, and the last, facing the first office canticle, depicts Pentecost. This arrangement seems to make no sense whatsoever, because neither depiction correlates in any evident manner with the historiated initial on the leaf it faces. The final 2 miniatures in the volume, depictions of the Annunciation and the raising of Lazarus, which preface respectively the very highly abbreviated texts of the Hours of the Virgin and the Office of the Dead, are unaccompanied by historiated initials. So that was a program particularly for the Psalter and Canticles. These are different. They are aesthetically rather than iconographically out of sync with all other openings in the volume, because both face text leaves without richly painted decoration comparable to that found on the 9 other text sleeves that face inserted full-page miniatures. These 2 openings that introduce the short and highly abbreviated text that I have characterized as afterthoughts are strikingly imbalanced. The miniatures of these openings are visually far too weighty for the text sleeves with which they are paired, resulting in a design scheme that departs from all other illustrated openings in the volume. How, one wonders, can one explain or account for the pictorial incongruities in this volume? Lacking historical evidence, I can offer only a working hypothesis to help explain the strange disjunctions between the subjects of the inserted full-page miniatures and the historiated initials they face, as well as the discordant placement of the full-page miniatures in the volume. Consider first the locations and subjects of the 3 full-page miniatures with depictions of the donors, which are arguably the most important in the manuscript. I don't think that the placement of the Annunciation, folio 305 verso, way late in the manuscript, I don't think that the placement of the Annunciation, one of the richest leaves in the manuscript, and the only leaf with border decoration with a gold ground, makes any sense at the end of the volume, facing a leaf without richly painted border decoration. Nor can I understand the placement of a miniature of David in penitence as an illustration for Psalm 1, 𝗧𝗹𝗸, blessed is the man, which in the tradition of Psalter illumination is normally a portrayal of King David as author of the Psalms, typically enthroned and playing a psaltery. The placement of this full-page miniature is doubly inexplicable because it makes no sense facing a historiated initial of Joab slaying Abner, which in the tradition of typological illustration, including the one that initial copies, ought to be accompanied by a miniature of the arrest of Christ. Equally strange, I can't find any explanation for the placement of a miniature of Pentecost as an illustration prefacing the first office canticle, 𝗧𝗹𝗸, which is from Isaiah 12. You can read it all you want, has nothing to do with the Pentecost. Just as in the previous example, the placement of this inserted full-page miniature is doubly problematical because it makes no sense facing an historiated initial of David beheading Goliath, which in the tradition of typological illustration from which that historiated initial derives ought to be accompanied by a miniature of the harrowing of hell. In short, none of the above-mentioned full-page miniatures seems to fit where it is located in the volume. To account for these glaring anomalies, I think that we have to assume first that in the production of this volume, there was a change of the intended program of illustration. To judge from the cycle of integral historiated initials, and I stress integral because they were done on the text pages, space was left of them, they're part of the first stage of manufacturing this manuscript. To judge from the cycle of integral historiated initial of events from the Old Testament that derive from such typological manuals as the Biblia Pauperum and the 𝗧𝗹𝗸 Humanae Salvationis, I think it likely that the original program of illustration would have called for a full cycle of 9 full-page miniatures of scenes of the Passion, and that the subjects of these miniatures would have matched up at all 9 places with those of the historiated initials from the Old Testament that they were meant to face. As we've seen, however, the 7 full-page miniatures of the Passion in the Ruskin Psalter Hours, that's from the arrest of Christ to the entombment, are all out of alignment with the Old Testament prefigurations they accompany. Equally, if not even more important, the 2 full-page miniatures that begin and conclude the cycle of illustration of the text of the Psalter and the Canticles are not of Passion subjects at all and have no plausible relationship of any kind to the historiated initials from the Old Testament that each faces. My hypothesis, which provides at least partial explanation for the most peculiar subjects and locations of the full-page miniatures in the present-day state of the manuscript, is that for reasons unknown to us, the makers of this manuscript either ordered or repurposed a set of illustrations conceived originally not for this volume, nor for any Psalter or Psalter Hours, but for a book of hours. By far the most popular book of private devotion during the 15th century, and the genre of book which was the principal specialty of the Flemish illuminators, comparable to those who worked on this manuscript. One key to this hypothesis is the fact that all the full-page miniatures are singletons. That is, inserted full-page illustrations on single leaves with blank rectos, which means that they could have been placed at any location in this or any other volume. With that in mind, if one rearranges the full-page miniatures found in this volume, one finds that they, in fact, make up a cycle of illustration that would fit most Flemish books of hours. In the picture cycle for this hypothetical book of hours, the Annunciation would have been the prefatory miniature for the Hours of the Virgin. That's what it is here, but not as here for a highly abbreviated version at the end of a manuscript, with no richly painted decoration, but at the beginning of a Flemish book of hours, where the rich gold border decoration of the miniature page would presumably have faced a text leaf for Matins of the Virgin with matching border decoration. In support of that observation, I note that the programs of decoration and illustration of illuminated manuscripts, all illuminated manuscripts, are in a large majority of instances front-loaded, with the most richly decorated leaves located at the beginning of the volume. This is the case for many Flemish books of hours of the third and the fourth quarters of the 15th century, and can be exemplified by a book of hours produced in Bruges, circa 1460 to 70, almost the same date. In this manuscript, the first two illustrated openings after the calendar, folios 6 to 7 and 8 to 9, display opulent gold panel borders, both for the miniature, it's prayer to a guardian angel, and there it's the beginning of the prayers to the apostles, both for the miniature and for the facing border. But this contrasts with all other openings in the volume, where the painted decoration, same volume, is on bare vellum. So the beginning of the manuscript has the rich gold on both pages. The rest has, just as the Ruskin Psalter Hours, decoration just on bare vellum. The openings of texts of the Hours of the Virgin in Flemish books of hours of the third and fourth quarter of the century are particularly richly decorated, as can be seen in an example from the Gulbenkian Museum at the left. It seems to me highly unlikely that the miniature of the Annunciation in the Ruskin Psalter Hours was not originally planned to face a text page with matching and similarly opulent border decoration. In a book of hours, the narrative cycle of 7 full-page miniatures of events from the Passion, these are the 7, notice not gold borders, would have functioned either as prefatory miniatures for the 7 hours of a text of the short hours of the cross, from the arrest of Christ to the entombment, or, less common but possible, a cycle of passion scenes for the hours of 𝗧𝗹𝗸 through Compline of a text of the Hours of the Virgin. There are some versions of the Hours of the Virgin that have, for the hours from 𝗧𝗹𝗸 through thing, a passion cycle, sometimes accompanied by a Marian cycle. Here's a cycle of the same subjects as you see there, at the Hours of 𝗧𝗹𝗸 through Compline, of the Hours of the Cross in a book of hours now in Brussels that was made in Ghent, circa 1470. Same subjects, from the arrest of Christ to the entombment, they match up perfectly, but for the short hours of the Hours of the Cross. In a book of hours, the full-page miniature of David in Penitence, upper left, which is mismatched facing an historiated initial of a prefiguration of a scene from the Passion, would have prefaced a text of the 7 penitential Psalms, which is a central component of all books of hours and is also the most commonly found illustration of that text in books of hours produced in France and Flanders at this time. As examples, I show openings from a Flemish book of hours of circa 1460 that belongs to Rare Book School, got one in there, upper right, and from a later Flemish book of hours of circa 1470, formerly owned by the dealer Heribert Tenchers. And you can see from the rubrics, these are both texts of the seven penitential psalms and litany, that's where you find penitence in Flemish books of hours. In a book of hours, the full-page miniature of Pentecost, upper left, which makes no sense as an illustration for the office canticle 𝗧𝗹𝗸𝗁, would have prefaced the text of the short hours of the Holy Spirit, which is another central component of most Flemish books of hours. Here are examples, look at the other two, from the Flemish Book of Hours of 1460, approximately, in the collection of Rare Book School, and below, a Book of Hours from the Franco-Flemish border region, dating, again, circa 1470-80, same date as our manuscript. In books of hours, finally, a full-page miniature of the raising of Lazarus would have prefaced the text of the Office of the Dead, as it does here, that is the Office of the Dead. But not as here, where the full-page miniature of this subject faces a text page with no border decoration whatsoever, but in a context where it would have faced a page introducing the Office of the Dead that had decoration comparable to that on the facing full-page miniature. As an example, I show an opening from a Flemish Book of Hours of circa 1490 in the 𝗧𝗹𝗸𝗁 Museum in Krakow. That's at the right. Viewed as illustrations conceived or intended originally for a Flemish Book of Hours, this outline encompasses all 11 full-page miniatures in the Ruskin Psalter Hours. It orders them in a coherent scheme typical of Flemish books of hours of the period, and resolves all of the striking irregularities of the distribution of the full-page miniatures in the manuscript. Contra that hypothesis, one might observe that the painted border decoration of all the full-page miniatures that illustrate the Psalter and Canticle matches that found on the facing text pages. But that's no impediment to the hypothesis if one allows that the inserted full-page miniatures could have been acquired without border decoration, and that the border decoration of the full-page miniatures and those of the facing text pages in the Psalter and Canticles were executed after the miniatures had been acquired and were placed or set to be placed in their present locations. To conclude, 30 minutes. To conclude, I don't have any evidence or suggestions to offer about how or why there was a change of program for the illustration of this manuscript, nor why a cycle of full-page illustrations that I think was conceived for a book of hours was repurposed, retrofitted as it were, for a Psalter Hours. One possible consideration could be that the makers of this manuscript were used to producing books of hours and therefore had ready and easy access to miniatures conceived to illustrate that text. The makers of this manuscript, for that matter, may have had little experience illustrating Psalters or manuscripts of Psalter collects, which were very rarely commissioned or used by moneyed lay patrons in Flanders during the late Middle Ages. I note as well, I mentioned this earlier, that there are indications in this manuscript that the manuscript was produced hastily and perhaps under a tight deadline. There are blank spaces for the rubrics that were never executed before all of the 150 psalms and collects that accompany them. Even Psalm 1, there's a blank space next above the atmosphere. By the way, all of this decoration here, and as I pointed out below, both for the prayers and each of the 150 psalms. That section of the book seems to have been done hastily. One might consider, finally, that the patrons of the Ruskin Psalter Hours changed their minds about the type of devotional manuscript they wanted to acquire only once images had already been ordered or acquired for a book of hours. They may have started out wanting a book of hours. In this scenario, they may have decided to request a Psalter collect with canticles with only 2 highly abbreviated texts from traditional books of hours, added as a supplement to a volume chiefly of psalms and collects. And by the way, the 2 added texts, those abbreviated versions of the Hours of the Virgin and the Office of the Dead, they do have rubrics. Whatever the causes, it seems evident that the cycle of illustration of the Ruskin Psalter Hours is iconographically and in places aesthetically disjunctive and even incoherent. I'll be keenly interested to learn if members of this audience, or others not in attendance today, can offer any observations capable of explaining and justifying the present-day arrangement of its cycle of illustration, or if they can provide alternate hypotheses to account for its apparent idiosyncrasies. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Very thought-provoking. I'm sure there are questions, and I'm going to walk around with one of these microphones and just ask that you share it through the microphone so that people viewing remotely can hear.
Jim, thank you so much. Deborah and I are we're totally on board with this whole idea.
Well, that's not going to be helpful.
No, I actually have a question, which is I have a question, not a comment. Based on your finger appearing in the images, it looks this manuscript is teeny tiny. Right?
It's reasonably small, but that was at that time I had a very large figure. Yeah.
Is that typical for the genre?
Books of hours, and for the hours of Jean Devreux come from all the way from that size to really quite monstrous ones, particularly the English ones. So I mean, it's like you can order a small car or a big car, or a small house or a big house. It's not out of the range for Flemish books of hours of the 15th century or of this period.
So I have a question too, because previous owner, John Ruskin, is known for cutting up manuscripts. And so do you think any of this has to do with his ownership?
That's a great question. As far as I know, Ruskin has never been known to or accused of repositioning leaves in his manuscripts. He cut them down and he cut them up, sometimes to give away leaves to many friends, including some of the most important manuscripts in the world. The sister manuscript of the St. Louis Psalter, now in the Fitzwilliam Museum, the Hours of Isabella, Psalter Hours of Isabella, another Psalter Hours, though not with collects. He cut at least a dozen leaves out of that manuscript and gave them away to people, including some in the Bodleian. And it took a long time to get most of them back. That's one of the greatest manuscripts in the Fitzwilliam. So as far as I know, he never repositioned leaves in his manuscripts.
It is. If you wrote to the Jefferson family in the mid-19th century and asked politely, though you were a total stranger, they would send you a Jefferson letter. Eventually, they began to run out, so they would only send the signature, which they would cut out. Our attitudes have changed so much. Everybody blames poor John Ruskin for his barbarity in cutting up those manuscripts, but everybody else was
it was very normal and
at the same time. So they're all in hell burning. We know that, but there are a lot of them, not just Ruskin.
It was actually recognized as generous. He did it only to his friends, and he was sharing stuff he loved. That was his view of it. He knew they didn't have a function in the sense of people weren't praying those prayers or using liturgical books anymore. They were, in a sense, works of art, and he was sharing them.
I had a
Question? Yeah, I'm going to read it for you. Right. I will read it for you.
Thank you.
The observation is David in Penitence shows David kneeling before a piece of furniture with a text. And therefore it is the portrait of the patron. The two figures face one another.
Yeah.
Yeah. The patron is depicted kneeling before a prie-dieu with a text. Had the illuminator shown David as the author of the accompanying text, as was conventional, then he could not have made a match with the patron. Could you respond to that? And there's more. Oh, yeah, sorry. The matter must for now remain speculative, but it seems we have evidence for a hypothesis that the patron identified with David. Moreover, perhaps the patron was named David, either his first name or a family name. Yeah. Would you respond to that?
Well, again, lack of evidence is very difficult. It is extremely common. If you show donors kneeling at prie-dieus, prayer tables, and they both are man and woman, it is tradition to have an open book. book dealing at preachers, and they both have open books. David does not have a book, but showing the owners of prayer books with an open book and praying is very common, almost expected. As to the positioning, I mean, clearly they took a bit of delight in changing the position of the donors in all three. The symmetry, David's not praying. David is, because the angel is coming down to save him. He's kneeling, but that's also normal. David is asking for forgiveness for his sins. Asking forgiveness from his sin. That's why it's always the headpiece to the seven penitential psalms. And those particular psalms are in fact psalms of asking for forgiveness. Psalm 1, blessed is the man. He's not the psalm.
He's saying the two pictures are pendant. Neil?
But again, I mean, that's within the realm of decoration found in rich Flemish illuminated manuscripts, even having them pendant. And there are other examples known where donors are shown not just with the Annunciation, which is most common, but with the seven penitential psalms, because they particularly had something to ask for forgiveness for. Sometimes those are the pages with coats of arms.
It's one follow-up. What is on the altar below David?
Well, his harp or psaltery is
Or
here,
before David, I'm sorry.
and his head is on top, and it's not an altar; it's a table. At least it looks pretty much like a wooden table. It doesn't look like a traditional, so it does have that sort of fancy triangle form sticking up. I'm not sure. It doesn't look anything like this altar to me.
What's the white?
I'm not sure what that is.
Is there something white up there that, do you know what that is?
Something.
In the top shelf of that, yeah. That's the, oh, okay. Thank you.
That's maybe ermine turned up and a red back.
One of our classes, we're talking about manuscript waste, and something I can't imagine is finding a Psalter, even a book of hours, a piece in a being used as an end leaf in early manuscript book. But the something I wanted to ask is if have you used digital photography to make the whole thing available as a document that can be shared?
No, well, it's owned by probably the most distinguished dealer in illuminated manuscripts nowadays, 𝗧𝗹𝗸. He only acquired it late December, January from a collector I know pretty well. He bought her collection in block. And I only had 2 or 3 days to look at and describe and photograph a good half dozen of the manuscripts that interested me the most. And this was one of them right away. I mean, they had it miscatalogued in many respects. But look, why is this interesting to people in rare book school? Because it shows a book is not just a finished, complete, perfect thing. Changes take place. There can be a change between the initial conception of the book and what's finally done. There can be a change of program. There can be a repurposing of books. This is a more elaborate example than you sometimes see, I think, but it's part of the life of books. And there's a lot of work going on about the life of books, reception history. Kate Rudy does some great stuff and so forth. It's part of the whole life of books that we should be more attentive to and repays looking and thinking about.
Thank you for this just brilliant talk. It's fascinating and riveting, and I love how you sussed out all that evidence, especially drawing on our Flemish Book of Hours, which came and foliated many years ago. My question is about the provenance of the Ruskin copy between its manufacture and Ruskin's ownership, and if the binding provides any clues. So if you could talk a bit about any other evidence of ownership or the binding, I'd be grateful.
It's a quite modern binding, and what we know is virtually the entire provenance after Ruskin, but not before. He gave this manuscript, like many others, to Arthur Severn, who was a relative. They went to a guy named Whitehouse, who was also a close family friend, who had a lot of Ruskiniana and even Ruskin manuscripts at a school called the Pembroke School on the Isle of Wight. And they eventually, it was called the something Education Trust. And they were sold in 1956. That was the sale where this manuscript appeared. And that is at that moment that it went in, I think, 56 into this private collection. So we know a lot about the provenance from Ruskin on, but essentially nothing before. And the binding is relatively modern. I knew it, and I think pretty sure the Grolier copy catalog has a price in it. So I'll remind myself. It was actually, I think it was moderate. In fact, it may have been one of the higher prices in that sale. But that sale was not full of rich Ruskin manuscripts. And remember, it was not Ruskin's sale. It was Whitehead, I think his name was, for the Pembroke School.
So the speed, there's evidence of speed throughout the manuscript, right? The celerity of composition, the absence of rubrics, the failure to match, the hasty adding. Obviously, one could supplement what you're doing with some codicological evidence, I think, as you adverted to. But you know, we're in Bruges. These books of hours, these psalters with the accompanying collects are often given as anniversary gifts. They're often given as wedding gifts. They're often given as occasional books to commemorate the completion of the building of a chapel that will be then consecrated on a particular day, right? A feast day. Sure. So there are all sorts of reasons to imagine that this is a hasty production to meet an anniversary, wedding, chapel dedication, the arrival of a bishop, you know, for a merchant in Bruges, right? And so, you know, when we ask that key question of bibliography, you know, broadly conceived, how did this book come to be the way it is, given the date, given the anomalies, given the signs of celerity? It seems to me pretty obvious they're trying to make a deadline. And then I wonder if interrogating the calendar might help us understand what that deadline might be.
Well, I've looked pretty closely at the calendar. It's full of, in addition to the two most famous tells for Bruges, Basilius and Donation, it's full of saints from northern France, Anomalies and things like that. It's interesting. It has 4 saints who have English connections, but that's not enough to say it was written for an English. If it really made for the English market, and by the way, they made hundreds of manuscripts to export to Bruges, to England rather. but those have many more English saints, Osiph and Edith and so forth, Cuthbert. On top of that, if there's an Hours of the Virgin, if it's made for an Englishman, it's 𝗧𝗹𝗸, and the Hours of the Virgin here is Romulus. So I've tried that. When you get into the stylistic sources of the manuscript, it gets a little even more complex. And by the way, I mean, it'd be interesting. That wonderful miniature of the Pentecost, it's actually a copy of an engraving by the master E.S. And on the left margin, there's a stag scratching his nose that comes from one of the playing cards. So the use of prints, the block book, an engraving, a playing card has an important role to play in the manufacture of these books. A lot of the grotesques or monkeys playing in the margins of the book, they all come from the vocabulary of a man called 𝗧𝗹𝗸 van Latham, who was an illuminator in Ghent. And so I can say with some confidence that whoever these people were, they came from the circle of 𝗧𝗹𝗸 van Latham. They're imitators, they're taking his stuff. But interesting, two of the miniatures, the Annunciation and David in Penitence, the compositions are very closely rooted in illumination from Rouen in northern France. They come right out of that tradition. So your question, what do you make of this? And by the way, I didn't get into this because I'm talking about iconography here. There are at least 5 hands in this manuscript. The chap who did the historiated initials. There are 4 people who did the full page miniatures, possibly more, but certainly at least 4. And they may have had different backgrounds. Maybe the fact that there's some Rouen roots might explain why there's a couple of English saints in the Flemish manuscript. Rouen was under English occupation for much of the 15th century, etc. Endless with manuscripts. I don't have to tell some of the manuscript scholars here. The number of questions that every manuscript poses is almost endless. And we can't solve them all, but it's nice to ask them and to think about them.
All right, thank you, Jim. I am relaying first many thanks in the chat online to you. Lots of accolades there. Alana Krug wants to know, and kind of maybe following on what you're saying about Rouen, are the 𝗔𝗯cie images in the initials typical of historiated initials specifically from Bruges, or is this one of the elements that's unusual in the manuscript?
There's nothing unusual about historiated initials. I think what's distinctive.
I think the gray initials.
No, well, there's nothing distinctive and unusual about bourgeois manuscripts making use of 𝗔𝗯cie. There are whole manuscripts that were done almost completely in 𝗔𝗯cie. And one of my former students, Elizabeth Moody, really believes that this was people in the circle of Philip the Good who were he only dressed in black. He's famous for that. And or aligning himself with him. There are other manuscripts, books of Hours, that alternate a colored opening and a 𝗧𝗯cie opening, and a colored opening and a 𝗧𝗯cie opening, right all the way through. There are other manuscripts, and I think this might be true here. If you put the Old Testament, it's a unique compassionate color. The Old Testament is deeper. That's one of the ways it can be used. So there's nothing unusual about finding 𝗧𝗯cie. I think the fact that it's used here with typology is that business, the foreshadowing, and then the full color, the realization in the life of Christ. But what a little bit strange is I know we all know a lot of Flemish illuminators, those of us who study Flemish illumination. I can't point with confidence. In your own book, there's description. I'm surprised not to know any but illuminated manuscripts, but that happens.
So my question is, what's on the recto of those full illuminated pages? What's on the other side? The blank,
Blank.
the text? Okay.
And that was very common. We know for as early as 1424 that the Guild of Illuminators in Bruges, and they repeated this legislation, passed a law forbidding the importation of single leaf miniatures from Utrecht, because Dutch illuminators, who always did miniatures on single leaves, as opposed to Flemish ones who only sometimes did, were doing a market, especially the low end, by making miniatures and sending them to Bruges. So it's not uncommon that in manuscripts at every level of the cost spectrum, from the lowest to even some of the most important, to have leaves, miniatures done on inserted single leaves. One of the reasons for this is that it enabled you to save time by having the people making the miniatures while other parts of the book were being done, separation of work. Another one is that you could buy them separately. You could move them around and sell them, and I think some of that happened here. We're moving around, certainly. It just increased the marketability, and it gave more opportunity for painters, craftsmen, to work not just for local market, but an export market. It's one thing to take a commission to do a manuscript in your hometown, but it's another thing if you can sell single leaf miniatures to someone down the road. Or, very common, by the way, manuscripts made in monasteries and convents, and some of them almost had to be made in manuscripts in convents, like choir books and other kinds of liturgical books. They specifically had to ask secular artists either to come in and paint in the manuscript or to buy their miniatures and put them in. For example, there is a benedictional Robert Leclerc in the University Library in Cambridge, and Robert Leclerc is a known priest and monk, and he had Simon Benning. He bought single leaf miniatures from Simon Benning, the greatest Flemish illuminator of that period, 1520s, to put in his benedictional.
So it doesn't strike me as unusual, this idea of the sort of like mix and match of different parts. I've seen it happen in books of hours, for example. I don't think in a Psalter, maybe it's a little more unusual, but do you think that this is something that happened at a contemporary time? Because I don't know, I had a book of hours recently that I sold to an institution that the decoration was 15th century Lyon. The binding was mid-16th century Lyon, and it was signed by the person who had it done. And this person clearly put together different parts of older materials that he could find around. And so I was wondering if this may be a similar situation of sometime later, someone like did this on purpose, but it was not like conceived as such.
I don't think they're appreciably later, because the decoration, less for these fancy frontispieces with the donors, but the Passion ones on the miniatures matches that on the text pages, so they had to be finished in the same place, I think. And by the way, this business about different illuminators collaborating, sometimes it's questionable to book like this, but some of the absolute most important and richest Flemish books of hours, made for people at the absolute top of the social hierarchy, have miniatures by a half dozen or more of the best illuminators. And Simon Marmion and the Master of Mary of Burgundy and so forth. And it's clear for those books, they wanted all the stars to come in and do a bit. It's just like at Grand Opera. Yeah, in Grand Opera, the choir, they're local, but you get a star to fly in from Milan and a star to fly in from Paris and one from Russia, and they're all stars. That's what the greatest opera houses are playing on, as opposed to the small ones, which only use in-house things. But some of these Flemish manuscripts, with the richest, most beautiful thing, intentionally have miniatures by all of the most important illuminators.
Here at Rare Book School, we get the stars to fly in from Princeton. Please join me in thanking Professor Marrow.
Thank you.